Hi, I'm Mark. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a cope joint in baseboard molding. So there's a couple of ways you can deal with an inside corner on a wall with your baseboard molding. The most common is to just cut a 45-degree miter on either piece and bring those together into a joint. A lot of the time, using a 45-degree miter for your inside corners will work fine. But there are some problems with it. If the molding shrinks, say we get a little shrinkage on this side and the joint opens up, and then we get a little shrinkage on the opposite side and the joint opens up, that turns into a large opening in our joint. Another issue is if our wall isn't perfectly 90 degrees. Well, then you need to measure the angle on the wall and adjust your miter accordingly. Otherwise, especially if the wall is open from 90 degrees, you'll end up with an open joint like this if you don't make those adjustments. And the last thing is, because our 45s are just straight joints, there's the opportunity for movement up and down, both when you install it and over time. That's where the cope joint comes in. With a cope joint, on one side of the joint, I just cut a straight cut, and that goes right into the corner, and the opposite side of the joint gets coped. Then when I bring these together, I have a nice tight joint, and it doesn't matter if the wall isn't perfectly 90 degrees, because with this joint, I can open it or close it, and it stays tight. The other advantage is, because I've cut out around the profile, it somewhat locks the joint together, and it can't move up and down. The only real downside to a coped joint is it takes a little longer to cut it, but not much, and the more of them you do, the faster you'll get. And I think you'll see that the benefits of it far outweigh the small amount of time it takes to cut it. The first step to make a cope joint is to take our piece of molding that'll have the straight cut on it and install it into the corner. I'll fasten it with the brad nails, and now we can make the cope side of the joint. I need to cut a 45-degree bevel onto the end of the molding, beveling out or away from the corner. And we cut this joint just to give us a line to cut around the profile. Okay, with our 45-degree bevel cut, now we can see the profile of the molding. This edge or this line right where the white part of the molding meets the tan portion. And that gives us our guide to cut the profile of the molding or cope it. To cut the joint, I'll use a coping saw. Now there's a few tricks here. The first one we'll talk about is when you make the cut, you don't necessarily want the saw 90 degrees to the edge of the molding. You want to back bevel it a little bit. So in other words, instead of cutting a nice 90-degree end, I want to bevel it back in. And the reason for that is, again, if our wall isn't perfectly 90 degrees, by cutting this back bevel, we'll be able to adjust the molding to give us a nice tight joint. Another thing I like to do, especially on bigger moldings like this, is cut some relief cuts at points where the saw is going to bind, or in other words, as I curve the saw around these cuts, parts where there's a tight curve, you'll kind of learn as you cut a couple of these where the best points are to make your relief cuts. I'm going to cut one right here, right up into this point, and I'll go ahead and cut another one right in the middle of this tight curve. By cutting these relief cuts, now as I cut around the profile, these scrap pieces will fall out when I get to each of those relief cuts. So now I'll go ahead and cope the joint. I'll start at the back of the joint, again with my saw beveled over, and I just fall right along the white edge. Now at this top edge, this is a spot where I like to start the cut 90 degrees to the molding rather than beveled back. That way when I install this, I'll have a nice straight edge. So I'll start the cut at 90 degrees and then bevel the saw back once I'm in maybe a 1/16 of an inch. And there we have the joint coped. And again on the top you can see where I started that at 90 and then went ahead and did my back bevel so that'll fit nice and tight. Now depending on your project, this may be ready to install right now, or you may need to come back with some sandpaper and clean up the back side of the joint a little bit. Now where that's really going to be important is if you're working with a stain grade molding. I'm using moldings that'll get painted, so I'm going to be caulking all the joints. So if I have some minor imperfections, it's not going to matter. But if you're working with a stain grade where you don't want any of this joint to show or you don't want any gaps in the joint, you may need to come back with a little sandpaper, clean it up, and make it perfect. Okay, so we're back into our mock room here. I have my coped joint. I'll slide it up tight against the opposite piece of molding and nail it into place. So now that you know how to cut a cope joint, let's talk a little about workflow during installation. Here I've drawn a basic room. I have a doorway and 4 corners. There's a couple ways you can stage your workflow. Probably the easiest to do is to just start at one side of the door and work your way around the room. The reason this is important is when you go to install the pieces, our first piece here will get a square cut on either end, get installed between the casing and the wall. The next wall, I'll cut a square joint on this end and cope this end. Same thing here, square cut, cope, and square cut, cope, square cut, cope. Another way I can do this is to install my long wall back here first, so I have again a square cut on either end, and then work off of that back towards my door the same way. Cope, square cut, cope, square cut. What you don't want to do is start at your door and work both directions at once. If you do that, you'll end up, again, square cut, cope, square, 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 cope, square. And then when you go to install this long piece, you'll end up having to cut a cope on either end. That's going to be very, very difficult to measure and cut so you end up with a good tight joint on either end. So again, work off your long wall towards your door, or even better, start at one side of the door, work all the way around your room until you're done. So that's all it takes to cut a cope joint on baseboards. Give it a try on your next molding project. I think you'll find that once you get the cope cut down, it's a much faster and more precise way to install baseboards.